Hi, my name is Paul. I'm the pastor of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, and I'm doing a series of videos on Jordan Peterson. I've been fascinated by his presentations, and I've wanted to engage with them, and so I figured YouTube seemed about the best place to do it, and so far, based on comments, it's proven right. This seems to be a place that I can talk about what I'm discovering. I'm still working through his biblical series, Lesson 1. I call this a Prolegomena because I think really what he does, if you study theology, most of what his first lecture really is Prolegomena. Where do we found the things that we're talking about? And one of the early slides he begins with Nietzsche, and in my last video, which was very long, most of it, just pieces from Peterson and various interviews, I dealt mostly with Nietzsche and now Jung. I want to do a little brief review of what I dealt with in the last one. I talked about the fact that medieval Christianity and Christendom, possessed Europe in many ways and possessed the West. And as Peterson noted, Nietzsche's observation was that disciplined the European mind and focused it. Now, along comes the Protestant Reformation after kind of in the light of Renaissance humanism, Martin Luther, Erasmus, a whole generation of scholars are getting back to the sources, and there's this huge split in the church, and to a certain degree, the split in the church is over authority. Now, this is a very low resolution representation of what I'm talking about, but you have sola scriptura, where the Protestant churches say that Scripture is the basis of our knowledge. And that's a nuanced position from the Roman Catholic position, which said that, for example, the church, in a sense, produces Scripture, or the church gives birth to Scripture, whereas the Protestants said the church recognizes Scripture, and the Protestants wanted to make the Bible the arbiter, the judge, the playing field by which contradictory interpretations of the Bible could be adjudicated and resolved. The difficulty of the Protestant Reformation was that never really happened. That, in fact, the church fractured how many different ways, and that happened nearly right from the beginning. And so after the Reformation, there was 100 years of war between Protestants and Catholics. Now, these wars were not just about religion. Religion and politics were all intertwined. That was, if you read some of the current stuff on the Protestant Reformation, I mean, that's just a factor of the conflict. And so there was a whole generation of people who said, this is crazy how we're killing each other. We need to found a new basis for agreement and for life, so that we're not killing each other over religious interpretation. Now, ideally, they would have come up with one thing, but in fact, Europe was looking back over the classical period, and it really split into two things. You had rationalism, which is in a sense up in the cloud. It's disconnected from the world. It's pure reason. I think, therefore I am. On first principles, we can deduce what is truth. And then empiricism, which is kind of from the bottom, which is looking at the stuff of nature, and nature will ground us. And you can see in some ways you have heaven and earth with these two positions, and in some ways that when they come together, in some ways they form science, because science, as Peterson notes in that one clip I showed in the last video, science tries to get rid of all individuality and come up with a principle, a transcending principle to make individuality coherent. So in a sense, science does kind of put rationalism and empiricism together, but still the kind of unity Europe really can't come up with. But at the same time now, they find this system to be a better system, and we'll engage Sam Harris a little bit later in this. They find this to be a better system in a sense than fighting about the Bible, because people with differing interpretations of the Bible can agree with some of these things, either by reason or by observation. And then, of course, that leads Nietzsche to his death of God observation. Now after, as Peterson said, Nietzsche is in a sense the prophet of what is to come, and according to Peterson, Europe will now swing between nihilism and ideologies. And a little bit later I'll show a clip about how Peterson regards ideologies. Of course, Darwin comes along, and if you read the book The Metaphysical Club, part of the point that book makes is that plenty of Christians were assuming that God used processes for evolution. And Darwin's big statement was that we didn't need God to account for the world. And so therefore a lot of these medieval arguments that for many people in Europe were just common sense, that of course there's a God, because how can we account for the order we see in this world? Now Darwin comes along and says it's a process of natural selection. We don't need a God to produce this world. This world can be produced. We imagine we can see a process without a divine hand that can produce the world. And so in many ways, progressive ideas and the idea of progress rolls through Europe, and it takes on different shapes. And again, some of this is Yuval Harari's idea that really what the 20th century was three competing humanisms. And again, when we get to Sam Harris, it's important to see that Sam Harris and Bret Weinstein are all humanists. Nick Waltersdorf, who again is a philosopher from my tradition, taught at Calvin College and then at Yale Divinity School. Nick Waltersdorf made the observation a number of years ago that humanism is based on the imago Dei. This is all based on the idea that God made us in his image, and that gives humanity a privileged position over the rest of creation. What will happen to humanism when we give up the imago Dei? So what happens in the 20th century is that the Nazis believe in some idea of progressive racial evolution, and that fuels their ideas of exterminating the Jews and exterminating supposedly, suboptimal races. And of course, Nazis lose World War II. Now, the Soviet Union gets going and just on the heels of World War I, and they have this idea of progressive class evolution. And so they're trying to apply their ideas of class evolution, and as Bret Weinstein noted, their doctrine, and really the doctrine of both of these groups, hinders them, and they in fact lose the struggles of the 20th century. And what emerges is the West. And the West also has progressivist ideas. But the West, in a sense, believes, they're more Darwinian in a sense, in that they believe in the market. And the market is a place of competition. And it's competition between economic factors, and it's competition between ideas, and it's competition between moralities. And this is the idea that the West says, well, this is what's driving progress. It's the competition between all of these forces, and we need to let them play. And this very much is an expression and really an evolution of classical Western liberalism. Now, the difficulty that we wind up with, however, is, okay, so we can account for the creation of the world and the differentiation of animals and the physics of the sun and the planets coming together with these rocks as they cool, and we can account for all of this. And somewhere again between rationalism and empiricism, but what we can't account for is morality. And you'll often hear Peterson talking about Hume, that you can't get an ought from an is. And as we saw in the lectures with some of the debates with Sam Harris, and I'll play, and the ones with Weinstein, both Sam Harris and Weinstein on one hand say we can account for how we are and what we do to a great degree by evolution. This is how we can account for who we are. But now both of them will say, but evolution is immoral. They would at least say evolution is amoral, but as in the clips I played last time, both of them critique evolution and say evolution is immoral. And I think part of this comes about, again, because of the Nazi experience. Before the Second World War, if you read broadly the late 19th, early 20th century, you will find many, many scholars touting, what we would look upon today as racist ideologies. And these things were simply common for educated people. What happens during World War II is that we see in Nazi Germany the horrible logical conclusion of this thinking, and we draw back from it and we say, well, this is immoral. Now, I completely agree 100%. The World War II wiped out a bunch of my distant cousins who didn't emigrate from Europe. But on what basis can you call this immoral? Can you fashion a Darwinian argument? And if so, why are some Darwinian observations moral and some Darwinian observations immoral? So what we are left with, again, is exactly where we were left at the end of the Protestant Reformation, which is, can we find morality from rationalism from above? Can we find morality from empiricism from below? Now, what I think this has led to is that we had a generation of, really a number of generations of people waiting to say, well, upon what can we found morality? And I think in many ways the world stopped waiting. And what has taken its place is, I'm gonna mention C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, which is one of my favorite books, and I can't get it out of my face. One of my favorite books, and a book that I try to read 2 or 3 times a year, simply because Lewis is so perceptive and at sussing through nature. And now Lewis is a rationalist, and so I think most people either tend to come from above or tend to come from below. So Lewis is a rationalist, and he's he likes Plato, and that's just who Lewis is. But where's I going with this? But Lewis begins to say, that the kind of the natural human state is a rather pantheistic state. And in terms of our religious assumptions, if you leave humanism alone, if you leave people alone, they will kind of on their own either devolve or evolve to a rather pantheist religion. Now, one of the fine books of a couple of years ago is David Brooks' The Road to Character. And David Brooks at the beginning of the book talks about where he sees the culture going. And as I looked around the popular culture, I kept finding the same messages everywhere. You are special. Trust yourself. Be true to yourself. Movies from Pixar and Disney are constantly telling children how wonderful they are. Commencement speeches are larded with the same cliches. Follow your passion. Don't accept your limits. Chart your own course. You have responsibility to do great things because you are so great. This is the gospel of self-trust. As Ellen DeGeneres put it in the 2009 commencement address, my advice to you is to be true to yourself and everything will be fine. Celebrity chef Mario Batali advises graduates to follow their own truth, expressed consistently by you. Anna Quindlen urges another audience to have the courage to honor your character, your intellect, your inclinations, and yes, your soul by listening to its clean, clear voice instead of following the muddied messages of a timid world. In her mega-selling book, Eat, Pray, Love, I am the only man to ever finish the book, says Brooks. I've never read it. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote that God manifests himself through my own voice from within my own self. God dwells within you as yourself, exactly the way you are. Now, Brooks looks at this and says, this is clearly where the culture is going. Now, if I look at C.S. Lewis and this book, I hear C.S. Lewis saying we are, in a sense, devolving back to this rather pantheistic posture that we as human beings tend to assume when we don't have anything else that's moving us. Now, I don't think it's a big jump from this pantheism, from this internal self-sufficiency that I am a God and the God is me, to this identitarian culture movement that we see Peterson very much engaging. Because if I am a God exactly how I am, then the whole world ought to adore me and and the whole world ought to make room for me and establish laws for the great me that I am, and everyone must use whatever pronoun I choose to use. If I tell my neighbors my pronouns are we, I'm going to take on the pronouns of kings and the divine we, and my third person pronoun is His Highness. So whenever you refer to me, please use the pronoun His Highness, and the divine me inside demands that the world comply. Now this obviously is a different posture from modernism, which said, well, there's an objective world out there, and we in fact need to negotiate and come to terms with this, and we in fact can be better in touch with this objective world if we collaborate and communicate together, and if I in fact can get beyond my own biases. Now this is where we get into the post-Nietzschean turn that Peterson makes in his Prolegomena, where you'll have in effect Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein producing their own values, and they believe they can. And again, if you go back at the other video and you look at what Peterson lectures in terms of his personality class, and he's quoting Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky is saying, am I piano keys? And you can read Tolstoy in his great I can't remember the title of the little book, his tiny little memoir that he wrote, the little spiritual memoir. It's a terrific little book. If we are just piano keys, then so what? The thing is, as both Harris and Weinstein say, you can't simply accept the morality of your genes. Your genes are amoral, if not immoral. So where do you go from there? Now, this is hardly a new thing. One of the most important books, I think it was written in the late aughts, maybe 2009, a book by a sociologist named Christian Smith. And what Christian Smith did was interview thousands or hundreds and thousands of young teenagers, and he wanted to interview them about their religious and their spiritual ideas. And this is what he found. He said, everyone decides for themselves. American youth, like American adults, are nearly without exception profoundly individualistic, instinctively presumingly autonomous, individual self-direction to be a universal human norm and life goal. Thoroughgoing individualism is not a contested orthodoxy for teenagers. Notice the word. It's an orthodoxy. This is, in fact, the baseline of our cultural belief. It is an invisible and pervasive doxa. That's a dogma. This is what we think. In fact, this is the bubble within which we live. That is an unrecognized, unquestioned, invisible premise or presupposition. U.S. teenagers' profound individualism informs a number of other issues, which he gets into. For most teens, nobody has to do anything in life, including anything to do with religion. Whatever is fine if that's what a person wants. Consequently, certain traditional religious languages and vocabularies of commitment, duty, now my thing's covering us, obedience, calling, obligation, accountability, and if you read Brooks's The Road to Character, these are all the things that he's talking about in terms of this transition that our culture's been in since the Second World War. Instead, religion is presupposed to be something that individuals choose and must reaffirm for themselves based on their present and ongoing personal felt needs and preferences. In other words, find the religion of your choosing. Second, most U.S. teens are at least somewhat allergic to anything they view as trying to influence them. Now, this, of course, is enormously ironic because we are immersed in a culture that is, usually for market reasons, always trying to influence us. And this is part of the challenge that marketing people have, because if they get too overt, then we recoil and say, oh, you're trying to influence me. So instead of saying, buy Apple, we just show someone who's attractive and appealing and that we esteem using the product, and we absorb it that way. But oh no, I'm not being influenced. They generally view themselves as autonomous mediators or arbiters from outside influences. And a little bit later, when we talk about Charles Taylor, we're going to talk about the buffered self. We very much imagine ourselves to be buffered selves. Other people and institutions provide information that youth see themselves as filtering, processing, and assimilating. Based on this information, they make their own decisions for themselves, or the story goes. And what I like to point out is that often if you talk to someone about Christianity, and usually a very common thing people will say is, well, I don't think it's fair that God would judge, let's say, someone who grew up in the Christian God would judge someone who grew up in a Muslim country for not being Christians, because, if they grow up in a Muslim country, well, they'll be Muslim. And that's right. We call this sociology of knowledge. But here's the funny thing about Americans. We all believe in sociology of knowledge, but we think that I, myself, am the exception to it. All those people growing up in that Muslim country, or all those people growing up in the bush in Africa, or all those people growing up in communist China, they're all being influenced by the culture that's around them. But me, I somehow stand above it. I am not a constructed self. I am my own autonomous person who chooses, and of course what I choose is clearly what's reasonable and rational, and as Garrison Keillor says, all the children in Lake Wobegon are above average. And so we live in these we are powerful bubble boys. Like many of the adults who are socializing them, they are often They often readily proffer decisive judgments as obvious facts that they take as self-evident to any reasonable person, such as, obviously you shouldn't hurt anyone else, or it's totally wrong to have sex with someone you don't really care about. I think that one's probably changing in our culture since the late 90s. What almost all U.S. teenagers and adults lack, however, are any tools or concepts or rationales by which to connect or integrate their radical, relativistic, individualistic selves on the one hand and their commonsensical, evaluative, moralistic selves on the other. And we see this today in our political polarization. We imagine that the politics that I embrace are so obvious and so self-evident. Now, I wouldn't want to judge anyone, but all those other people over there are clearly stupid and need to be jailed or silenced or put away because they just don't know anything. And what strikes me about this position is that this position is so radically difficult to hold if you actually know people of other cultures, or read history, or travel, that we somehow imagine that here we have arrived. Now it's absolutely normal to believe that all of my ideas are right and any ideas that contradict them are wrong, because if I didn't believe my ideas were right, I would discard them and grab the other ideas I believed as right. But to not have the self-awareness that we ourselves are not exceptions to sociology of knowledge says that we're in many ways bubble boys and girls. But the difficulty is we are, as Jordan Peterson often reminds us, we are in fact the elites of the world. So we are powerful bubble boys and girls. And it's often the case that if you travel to other countries, and you can watch on YouTube now, there's no end of YouTubes of people of other countries saying what they think about Americans. Well, they see us as different. They're not within our bubble. So where does this leave us? Most U.S. youth tend to assume an instrumental view of religion. Now this is important because, in my experience, a lot of people decide to leave the church or stop praying or stop reading their Bible. Maybe they grew up with these things, maybe they didn't. Now there are a great many people in the United States who didn't grow up going to church now as the rates of church attendance recede. Now, I should also include Canada, obviously, because Peterson and many of his audiences are in Canada. But a lot of the assumption underneath the idea of what religion is for, even when you ask the question that way, is instrumental. And so people have a kind of a demythologizing story such as, you know, I sat down and I prayed for my grandmother who had cancer and God didn't hear my prayers and she died. Therefore, I know there isn't a God. And, you know, on one hand, that's a very reasonable approach because the whole problem of evil is founded on this. If God is good, if God is powerful, if God is loving, why wouldn't he heal my grandmother's cancer? Well, that's a very good question. But one thing that we often don't look at is that there's an instrumentalist assumption beneath that. And I want to play a little bit of the interview with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris about what a religion is, because I think Harris in many ways really boils it down in a succinct way, and I think part of the reason Harris has become so popular is because he's been able to articulate the assumptions of a generation. So let's listen to Harris.
To make of that claim generically, I think we should talk about your view of Christianity at some point soon to see if we can talk about specifics. But I just want to take a generic starting point, which for me is more accessible and I think more illuminating. It certainly describes the divide between science and religion that resonates with me. And I think it connects nicely to the way you were describing kind of our primal circumstance of being an individual or a tribe standing in the face of mute and often hostile nature and trying to figure out what's going on and how to live within it. I think that really is the primal circumstance. This is why I think of religion, as you know, as a kind of failed science, as a kind of first attempt to tell a story about what's going on that gives us some power over it. But it's a bad attempt because we didn't develop any kind of methodology at that point to differentiate fact from fiction.
We should pause there because pay attention now, because he's also located science. Religion is a sort of failed science to give us power over nature. Well, is that really what science is, or is that what we use technology for? So he's already kind of blurred science and technology, but you notice, again, what Christian Smith notes is this instrumental assumption as to what religion is. And I see this as a pastor all the time with church. People come into my church, often if it's someone coming in who I've had no contact with before. They come in desperate. They'll come in and after the service, Pastor, I want to join the church. Oh, why do you want to join the church? And I know some tragedies happen. They might have had a fight with their spouse. They're short of money. They're looking for help. They want me to pray. They're hoping that the deacons at the church can help them out with a financial need. They're desperate for something to fix something. And they imagine that if they can get this thing fixed, then their life can go on as usual. Now, yeah, and maybe we can't help them fix their thing. Maybe they'll just feel better after I'll pray with them. And maybe, in fact, something will be fixed and they'll say, oh, it worked, but their life will pretty much go on as before. But again, that expresses this rather instrumental assumption about what religion is for. So let's keep listening.
Take the case that every parent will be familiar with of standing helplessly over your sick child, wondering what's wrong. Let's say your child throws up and has a fever, and you don't know what's wrong with him or her. And this is obviously one of the more ancient moments for any person. And there's obvious evolutionary reasons why we would be concerned about this. And so this is quite Darwinian to care what's happening to your infant. But today, this primitive uncertainty and helplessness and fear is bracketed by a basic understanding of the processes in the world that can affect a human body. And there's obviously enough to worry about there to drive almost any parent crazy. But
now again, bracketed by what affects the human body. Now again, pay attention here because, okay, so a child is sick. So they might have a virus. Again, I've been reading the book 1493 and looking at, how malaria smuggled itself across the ocean in the bodies of Africans and Europeans and just how this works. So on one hand, I'm in no way delegitimizing the reality of the material world, But it's important to recognize that Harris is himself setting this up within a frame and setting up, okay, well, this is what religion is for.
One thing that is no longer on the menu is the evil eye. When your child gets sick, no part of your mind, if you're sane, is now devoted to the question of whether or not you should go burn your neighbor as a witch.
Now, I love this example because before I pastored in Sacramento, I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, and so we dealt with these kinds of things all the time. Now when he says no one who is sane, when I hear this, I think that's an awfully colonial posture to take. Now, no one who is sane, well, I would say, well, maybe a lot of people who are sane, but they are living within their own bubble. But what makes us think we don't have a bubble? What makes us think we don't have a culture? Now, we may very well believe that we are right, and the question of the evil eye, yes, someone looked at me funny, and I think that they put a spell on me, and therefore, or they put a spell on my child, and therefore my child is sick. I remember one day my child was 3 or 4 years old, and I had to walk a ways to my home, and it was cloudy, and it was starting to rain. I'm holding my child, I'm walking to the house, and a frantic woman, Dominican woman, comes up to him and says, "Hace daño, you're hurting your son." I said, "Why am I hurting my son? He's out here in the rain." And to me, it's like, I bathe the kid all the time. Little water isn't going to hurt him. So on one hand, I'm on Sam Harris's side, but at the same time, well, how about that evil eye when your neighbor looks at you funny and the wheels start to turn in your head and you start to think, well, are they putting something in my water? Are they putting something in my food? Are they saying things about me? One of the things that we might notice is the other Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein. Here's a guy that goes from the top of the heap all the way to the bottom. A man of enormous influence, power, and money goes all the way to being scumbag of the earth. Why? Reputation. Has anything material changed? In what realm? You cannot take what changed with Harvey Weinstein and put it under a microscope. You cannot see it on a slide. This is all relational, and this relational world is very real. So on one hand, I don't completely agree, actually, and we'll get into that. Yes, if your child is sick, see a doctor. But what does that mean? If you are depressed, and you're depressed because everyone in your neighborhood thinks you're a dirtbag, can that depression make you sick? Well, then, you say, well, that affected my mood and my chemistry. Okay, but now again, here, C.S. Lewis makes this point here. When I decide to move my hand to the controls on this computer, what's moving my hand? Isn't it, as C.S. Lewis and Jordan Peterson might say, spirit? Isn't, in a sense, spirit moving my hand? Well, how do we account for that?
Because she might have cast a malicious glance at your child, right? But as you know, that was not always so. And in fact, in Africa, people are still murdering their neighbors for the crime of witchcraft. So the problem, from my point of view...
Sorry about leaving that on during that. People in Africa are still murdering their neighbors for the crime of witchcraft, which I think is a rather funny thing, because people and neighbors in Africa and the United States and Canada are murdering their neighbors because they're jealous of their spouse, because they're murdering their spouses because they said something wrong to them, because they haven't filled their expectation. We are still murdering people because of thoughts. Now, you might think, well, that evil eye put a hex on them. Okay, but they looked funny at me, and so by road rage, I pull out my gun and shoot them. Is there really a lot of difference? Now, obviously, I'm not advocating that we set up and try people for giving the evil eye, but we, in fact, do try people for all kinds of other relational crimes that are, in fact, relational and not material.
Is twofold. One is that we know that there's a path forward to rule out things like witchcraft and the evil eye, and that this path is science and rationality generally.
Again, also watch the presumptions. There's a path forward. Okay. Now I agree. We live in a better world, but that is, in fact, and again, another assertion.
But the other problem is that you could still play this game by resort to ancient stories and finding some connection between those stories and evolution. You could play a game of dignifying a belief in magic, in this case, the evil eye specifically, along Jungian lines or archetypal lines or something. You could be sympathetic with this picture. But my point is,
now again, he's basically making a moral assertion here. He's making a moral argument, and we might ask, well, and I agree with him to a certain degree. Well, I think it's better that we not try people for witchcraft, but we regularly try people for their relational crimes, for hating someone. There is in fact a category of hate crimes. And so what really is the basis for the distinction here? That you've got one story over here and another over here, and you're saying, I have a moral problem with this story. Okay, I have moral problems with lots of stories. But why? What is your moral foundation? Upon what criteria do you state that this morality is problematic?
what would be the point of that? I mean, given the obvious harms that we no longer need commit based on disavowing this ancient ignorance, why would one spend any time at all trying to make sense of an admittedly ancient concern about sympathetic magic?
What other ancient concerns don't we have? What other things don't we bring from the past into our present? And this is fundamentally the difficulty I have with Sam Harris, in that there's a whole bubble around him. He is the heir of this process that happens in Renaissance humanism and the Protestant Reformation and the grabbing onto rationalism and empiricism and the death of God. He is the heir of all of this. All of this is ancient, and in many ways, this is exactly the point that Peterson is making with all of this, and saying we're standing on the shoulders. Do we need to do sifting? Hey, I sift as much as anyone, but let's ask ourselves, the broader questions about where this stuff comes from. Let's see. Now again, Sam Harris's religion. I wrote this slide a little bit ago. Now I can't remember what I was going to say. Fails instrumentally. Well, religion. Okay, this is posture about religion. Religion fails instrumentally. Religion fails morally. But then the question that, in a sense, Peterson and Nietzsche are saying, what do you replace it with? And the question that they are asking is, what can't you see? And now, if you remember, maybe I won't play it right now. If you remember Brett Weinstein in the Joe Rogan, I'll play it anyway. Brett Weinstein basically makes the assertion, this is the top level truth.
As I see it, at least, there is this overarching truth, the one that Sam Harris was pointing to, the one I think you're pointing to also, and the one I'm imagining we all subscribe to.
Sure.
Right? There is the testable truth that reveals itself in the laboratory or in a careful experiment in the field. And that really is the top level truth. But then there are the truths you can't.
Got to remember to turn the light on. Here he says again, that really is the top level truth. Well, how do you know? And again, this gets back to my argument about the alligator in the pond. I told the story in the last one. You visit a gator farm in Florida. You see all these alligators in cement ponds and warm pools sitting there all day throwing in chickens. And you say, well, don't these alligators get bored? Why don't they just attack each other? No, they're well fed, they're happy, there they sit. And this is where you get to Dostoevsky, am I piano key? People are, in fact, if you feed them, yes, they're far more well behaved than if you don't feed them. But is this the top level truth? And I would assert, and I think this is essentially Peterson's assertion, people don't work this way. They really don't. And when I listen to Weinstein and Harris, part of me wants to ask, do you know people? Have you met people? I think Dostoevsky is far more insightful in saying, no, if you give someone everything they want, Tolstoy basically says the same thing. And in fact, Tolstoy lived it. He was a successful writer. He had a great reputation. He had a wonderful group of friends. He had all the money and pleasures he could. And what starts eating at him? It's the far bigger questions, the kinds of questions that religions often ask. And so then you have to ask the question, well, which are the top level truths? And what people seem to graduate to is saying, okay, well, I've got my food, I've got my job, and in fact, I find this with people all the time. I have everything set around me. Now what do I care about? And that's when they start to get into what the religions of the world have always been conversing about. Here we go. And to me, that's where this is exactly the point that Peterson moves now in terms of going from Nietzsche to Jung. Because the question is here, well, how can we account then for any reason to study the Bible? Because that's really the question. Why bother? Why do this at all? And Peterson says, well, I've got my personal reasons, but I want to talk about this because, in a sense, Peterson says, hey, I'm well fed. I've arrived at my career. Now I want to know why the heck I'm here. Now people have made the argument, well, that's just the brain being silly. You've got way too much extra power, so why think about it? Okay, but why do art? And why have ambition? And why have ideas that one thing is better than another thing? And so then when you come to the Bible, you say, well, why should we read this one book and not other books? And I would say, well, read all the books you can. But what about this book should warrant our attention? And so now Peterson is going to, in a sense, reject the implicit embrace of Nietzsche that Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris make in terms of trying to develop their own values and turn and say, we have already a platform of values that we should continue, and I'm not going to stand on is a little too uncritical, but I would say work. And in fact, I've been going through the book of Ezekiel right now in my adult Sunday school class. You can find all of that is on YouTube if you're interested in watching. But if you read the Bible, one of the things that you see is that the Bible doesn't just sit there. As Peterson shows, the Bible is hyperlinked. And so the New Testament is always working on the Old Testament. And I was just studying Ezekiel 18 for the last 2 weeks with my adult Sunday school class. And it begins with the question, really engaging an idea that's right there in the Ten Commandments. And it's working it over. Is it true that God punishes the children for the sins of the fathers? Is that true? Well, Ezekiel 18 takes on that idea, but then adds to it. And so what Brett Weinstein said, which I think was quite right, we shouldn't just uncritically take what we've been given, because I think actually uncritically we don't make it ours. And so we should in fact critically engage it and work on it. So let's take a look at where Peterson transitions from Nietzsche to Jung.
So I think it's very important that we sort out this problem. I think that there isn't anything more important that needs to be done than that. I've thought that for a long, long time, probably since the early 80s, when I started looking at the role that belief systems played in regulating psychological and social health. Because you can tell that they do that because of how upset people get if you challenge their belief systems. It's like, why the hell do they care exactly? What difference does it make if...
And this, I love this point because Peterson, again, if you look at his maps of meaning, he alludes to it here in this course that in the 1980s, and I'm a contemporary of Peterson, I'm about the same age he is. Yeah, in the 80s, why did the world almost blow itself up? For what? And I think in many ways you have to ask Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein, why do you care so much if Africans are still killing each other over the evil eye? Now, I agree that they care, and I care too, and I like that they care, but I think they have a more difficult time answering that question, why should you care? And that gets into the question that Peterson often gets into when he talks about the killers at Columbine and others, that we're invested in this for good reason.
If all of your ideological axioms are 100% correct, like people get unbelievably upset when you poke them in the axioms, so to speak. And it is not by any stretch of the imagination obvious why, but it's like there's a fundamental truth that they're standing on. It's like they're on a raft in the middle of the ocean and you're starting to pull out the logs, and they're afraid they're going to fall in and drown.
And again, this is an empirically validated thing that, for example, if we look at what's been going on in the Islamic world, or you look at the hotbed in the Middle East, or you look at the culture war in the United States, why are people so angry? Because what are we fighting about? In the United States, we're gloriously secure, at least many of us, and why do we care so much to fight this culture war? What is going on? And I think Peterson is right that all of this stuff, it matters to us. We don't know why it matters. We don't even know how it matters, but it sure does matter. And for the same reasons that, yeah, we might not kill each other over the evil eye in the United States, but we find our neighbor either putting Trump signs on the lawn, or Hillary signs on the lawn, or Bernie Sanders signs on the lawn, or flying a rainbow flag, or flying a Christian flag, and people are upset. They're ready to do stuff against each other. Why are we so connected to all of this non-material stuff? Why does the relational world matter so much?
It's like drowning what? And what are the logs protecting them from? And why are they so afraid to move beyond the confines of the ideological system? And these are not obvious things. So I've been trying to puzzle that out for a very long time, and I've done some lectures about that are on YouTube. Most of you know that. And some of what I'm going to talk about in this series you'll have heard if you've listened to the YouTube videos. But, I'm trying to hit it from different angles. And so Nietzsche's idea was that human beings were going to have to create their own values, essentially. Now, he understood that we had bodies and that we had motivations and emotions, like he was a romantic thinker in some sense, but way ahead of his time, because he knew that our capacity to think wasn't some free-floating soul, but was embedded in our physiology, constrained by our emotions, shaped by our motivations, shaped by our body. He understood that, but he still believed that the only possible way out of the problem would be for human beings themselves to become something akin to God and to create their own values. And he thought that the person...
Okay. Now, remember David Brooks, The Road to Character, that human beings would have to create themselves as God. This is, again, in a sense, what Ellen DeGeneres. Go to almost any commencement speaker and any commencement address in the country, at least in a secular forum, and you will hear something to the effect that you are right, you are beautiful, you are exactly who you are as you are. Now, what's striking about this movement around Peterson is that he is talking to people and saying, you're not. You're a mess. Now, as a Calvinist preacher, I'm very used to that, because if you look at Tulip, for example, and I'm not going to get into all of that right now, but total depravity, we begin with the assumption that there's something deeply wrong with me. And almost the first principle of my religion is, yes, there is something wrong with me. And not only is there something wrong with me, there's something wrong with me morally, there's something wrong with me in terms of my character, but again, if you look at, for example, 12-step, and remember that Peterson himself worked in the area of alcoholism and rehab, that the first step in the 12-step program is to say, I am out of control. and I need another power to possess me. I need another power to rescue me from myself. Now, that's a long way from saying you're a god. And so, in a sense, not only does Nietzsche predict what happens in the Soviet Union or encourage what happens in Nazi Germany, we can, in fact, in a sense, see Nietzsche in what's happening now in this movement since World War II in the United States, where first we say, I am godlike and the world must revolve around me. And then we say, well, this aspect of my identity is foundational and therefore the world must revolve around it.
He talked about the person who could create their own values as the overman or the superman. And that was one of the parts of Nietzschean philosophy that the Nazis, I would say, took out of context and used to fuel their, superior man ideology. So, and we know what happened with that. That didn't seem to turn out very well, that's for sure. And see, I also spent a lot of time reading Carl Jung, and it was through Jung and also Jean Piaget, who's a developmental psychologist, that I started to understand that our articulated systems of thought are embedded in something like a dream, and that dream is informed in a complex way by the way we act. So, we act out things we don't understand all the time. And if that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't need a psychology or a sociology or an anthropology or any of that, because we would be completely transparent to ourselves.
And again, read the Apostle Paul. The good that I would do, I do not do. Read Augustine's Confession. Talk about someone who's recognizing the layers to himself, and someone who's painstakingly going through those layers. When we realize we are not transparent, we are not transparent to ourselves. And again, this is an aspect that almost any religious tradition will look at, and this is exactly the level that most religious traditions will sit you down and say, you need to confront you. Because you don't know who you are, and you can't begin to deal with who you are and this entire world that you're living in and whatever bubble you're fabricating until you get in touch with who you are and what you are. And then the questions will be, well, what am I? And this is in fact where Peterson is going.
And we're clearly not. So we're much more complicated than we understand, which means that the way that we behave contains way more information than we know.
As a pastor, one of the things I appreciate about Peterson is that he's a clinician. And as a pastor, I hear this stuff and I say, oh, yes. It's so often the case that people say, and you find this in the press often, they'll say, well, this preacher is teaching this in church. Now, as a preacher, it's like, I know how little talking at people does, how little changes them. People often come up to me and say, Pastor, those people are doing wrong and you should tell them to stop. I'm like, oh, really? And do you think that will stop them? And, well, maybe if you tell them it will. And I think, well, I guess you've never watched me tell people to stop. I could stand up on church on Sunday morning and say, be good, not bad. And it doesn't mean that people will stop. People aren't like this. We are enormously mysterious. We are enormously complex. We are enormously not in touch with ourselves. And those who don't know this about themselves are the most not in touch with themselves. And those who don't take this into account when they think about people, well, I often just think, well, have you ever met a human being? Have you ever looked at one and watched one and paid attention to one? Because this is exactly what we're like. And you can see this if you're a pastor, if you're a school teacher, if you're a social worker, if you're a cop, if you're a judge, if you're a spouse, if you're a parent, if you're a child. It should be obvious to any of us if we're paying attention.
And part of the dream that surrounds our articulated knowledge has been extracted as a consequence of us watching each other behave and telling stories about it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, extracting out patterns of behavior that characterize humanity and trying to represent them partly through imitation, but also through drama and mythology and literature and art and all of that to represent what we're like so that we can understand what we're like. And that process of understanding is what I see unfolding, at least in part, in the biblical stories. And it's halting and partial and awkward and contradictory and all of that, which is one of the things that makes the book so complex. But I see in it the struggle of humanity to rise above its animal forebears, say, and to become conscious of what it means to be human. And that's a very difficult thing because we don't know who we are, what we are, where we came from, or any of those things. And, you know, the life is an unbroken chain going back 3.5 billion years. It's an absolutely unbelievable thing. Every single one of your ancestors reproduced successfully for 3.5 billion years. It's absolutely unbelievable. And we rose out of the dirt and the muck, and here we are, conscious but not knowing, and we're trying to figure out who we are. And a story that we've been telling, or a set of stories that we've been telling for 3,000 years, seems to me to have something to offer. And so when I look at the stories in the Bible, I do it, I would say, in some sense, with a beginner's mind. It's a mystery, this book, how the hell it was made, why we preserved it, how it happened to motivate an entire culture for 2,000 years and to transform the world. Like, what's going on? How did that happen? It's by no means obvious. And one of the things that bothers me about casual critics of religion is that they don't take the phenomena seriously. And it's a serious phenomena. I mean, not least because people have the capacity for religious experience and no one knows why that is. And I mean, you can induce it reliably in all sorts of different ways. You can do it with brain stimulation. You can certainly do it with drugs. There's especially the psychedelic variety. They produce intimations of the divine extraordinarily regularly. People have been using drugs like that for God only knows how long, 50,000 years, maybe more than that, to produce some sort of intimate union with the divine. It's like, we don't understand any of that. When we discovered the psychedelics in the late 60s, it shocked everybody so badly that they were instantly made illegal and abandoned in terms of research for like 50 years. And it's no wonder, because who the hell expected that? Nobody. Now Jung was a student of Nietzsche's, you see, and he was also, I would say, a very astute critic of Nietzsche. He was educated by Freud, and Freud, I suppose, in some sense, started to collate the information that we had pertaining to the notion that people lived inside a dream. You know, it was Freud who really popularized the idea of the unconscious mind. And we take this for granted to such a degree today that we don't understand how revolutionary the idea was. Like with what's happened with Freud is that we've taken all the marrow out of his bones, so to speak, and left the husk behind. And you know, now when we think about Freud, we just think about the husk because that's everything that's been discarded. But so much of what he discovered is part of our popular conception now, including the idea that your perceptions and your actions and your thoughts are all, what would you say, informed and shaped by unconscious motivations that are not part of your voluntary control. And that's a very, very strange thing. It's one of the most unsettling things about the psychoanalytic theories, because the psychoanalytic theories are something like, you're a loose collection of living sub-personalities, each with its own set of motivations and perceptions and emotions and rationales, all of that. And you have limited control over that. So you're like a plurality of internal personalities that's loosely linked into a unity. You know that because you can't control yourself very well, which is one of Jung's objections to Nietzsche's idea that we could create our own values. See, Jung didn't believe that, especially not after interacting with Freud, because he saw that human beings were affected by things that were deeply, deeply affected by things that were beyond their conscious control. And no one really knows how to conceptualize those things. You know, the cognitive psychologists think about them in some sense as computational machines. And the ancient people, I think, thought of them as gods, although it's more complex than that. Like rage would be a god. Mars, the god of rage, that's the thing that possesses you when you're angry. You know, it has a viewpoint and it says what it wants to say, and that might have very little to do with what you want to say when you're being sensible. And it doesn't just inhabit you, it inhabits everyone, and it lives forever, and it even inhabits animals. And so it's this transcendent psychological entity that inhabits the body politic like a thought inhabits the brain. That's one way of thinking about it. It's a very strange way of thinking, but it certainly has its merits.
I think that's a good place to stop for now. These videos get long. I won't play too much more. But I before a few years ago, I came across Jonathan Haidt's work and was very much gripped by it. And Haidt too is Haidt doesn't profess any Christian belief at all. But if you read his first book, and I think it's quite a helpful book. I found it quite helpful when he set up at least our anthropology as something like an elephant and a rider. The mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict, like a rider on the back of an elephant. The conscious reasoning part of the mind has only limited control of what the elephant does. Nowadays, we know the causes of these divisions and a few ways to help the rider and the elephant work better as a team. But Haidt begins the book with the divided self, and we'll talk about how we are in fact divided. And he has a quote from the book of Galatians. He has a quote from you look at Romans chapter 7, and we are terribly conflicted, and we don't know what we're doing. And so I found Haidt's idea of a rider and an elephant, that rider is severely outmatched by that elephant, and the elephant is this, in a sense, this unconscious self. And every time I have a number of children, and every time I would teach my child to drive, I would tell them about the rider. Well, actually, only my last one's got it because I read the book too late in the process. But I would tell them about the rider and the elephant, and it's not unlike riding a bike or driving a car, where in effect you learn to drive a car by taking what at the beginning is a tremendously conscious thing and teaching your unconscious brain to process it. And that's a good deal of what we do. We do it with math. We do it when we learn an instrument. You will mess up your free throws when you play basketball if you sit there and you think about it. Well, why is that? And why is it that, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 7, the good I would do, I don't do, and the evil I don't want to do, I do. Who can save me? And this is the human condition. And Haidt goes back and looks at a whole number of examples from philosophy and different religions to try to just simply highlight this point that we're disconnected. Now I think following Haidt, and here's another low representation drawing of me, in a sense what we are these selves. And I've really appreciated Peterson's articulation that there are these, oh shoot, no, I can't remember. We're a plurality loosely linked into a unity. We have these selves inside of us, and some of our language has gotten into this, but we're a jumble of those. If you watch the movie Inside Out, you've got all those little cartoon characters at the control rooms, and you've got rage, and you've got all these different emotions, and they're trying to make the whole thing work, and they're working as a committee. But as a pastor, I see this all the time with people, and I see this as myself. And so now the idea from Jung is that all these selves are watching, and we know way more than we know right now in terms of our conscious brain. Our unconscious self is in fact enormous and only loosely connected with it, and we might get insights when we dream, or we have this experientially. We're sitting around and boom, an idea pops into my head. And that is in fact the strangest idea, that an idea would pop into my head. Well, where does that idea come from? Now again, when you get into questions of religion, you get into a lot of things. One of my favorite movies is Steve Martin's Leap of Faith. And I love the scene where he goes up to this cross and says, "Why did you make so many suckers?" And as a pastor, I know plenty of charlatan pastors. I know plenty of people who, whether sincerely or whether duplicitously, are so often simply manipulating people. And people are in fact so easy to manipulate. And so I come from a tradition that I think is fairly balanced in this. On one hand, I was reading a story from a friend of mine who was writing about the fact that his wife's grandfather was dying, and the family was around and they were keeping vigil. He wasn't in the room. In fact, he was someplace else, and he was, some of his favorite hymns were going off in his head, and then suddenly into his head pops a rather obscure Dutch hymn. Now, I'm from the Christian Reformed Church, a lot of Dutch Reformed people. A rather obscure Dutch hymn that was translated into English and that just filled his mind. And later he finds out, in talking, he shares the story with his wife and finds out, well, that's just exactly the time that her grandfather passed. Now, again, could that be coincidence? Absolutely. But what does it mean that it popped into his head? And as a pastor, I talk to people all the time who I hear stories like this a lot. So on one hand, I say, well, I don't want to make too much of this, because I also have people all the time saying, well, God told me this. And I think, well, maybe he did or maybe he didn't. I suppose if God really wants to say it, he can tell me. But at the same time, things happen that are just mysterious. Read Craig Keener's book on miracles. He goes into that deeply, and C.S. Lewis doesn't go into this much. But Craig Keener's book on miracles, a massive study on miracles, which is story after story after story after story of things that are simply difficult to explain. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what is going on? And now this idea of this great cloud inside of us, makes good sense. But it actually doesn't necessarily explain anything, but it helps at least understand our experience. But now, then you get into the question, and actually I've got a lot of thoughts about this, and so in some ways these are my prolegomena, because the real issues that especially many who are engaging with Jordan Peterson are going to come down and say, well, what about the Bible? And so where Jordan Peterson is going to go is that we have this dream-like state, and it's dream is kind of the best word for it. And I think that itself is an example of, we can't articulate exactly what we're talking about, but it's from there, generations after generations, that these stories emerge, and there's an evolutionary process with these stories, and then these are the stories. And you can point to fairy tales and other religious traditions, and these are the stories that emerge from our dream-like state, and we don't know how they work, we don't know why they work, just like we don't know why music works. We really don't. But we know it does work, and we know that it's here, and so therefore we should honor it. But Christians have this story of divine revelation, that the whole idea of revelation is that God reveals. Now one of the things that I often try to point out with people, that is, at least in my tradition, and I think in many of the best established Christian traditions, we believe that, I got Bibles everywhere. We believe that the Bible is inspired by God, but it is organic inspiration. And what that means is not that, and I find certain groups of Christians don't know this. Certain religious traditions believe in what they call mechanical inspiration. The Latter-day Saints and Joseph Smith and the Golden Tablets and the Seeing Stones, this is God transcribes. And so then you have the problem of, well, does God make grammatical errors? Or I think the Muslims with the Quran have some similar ideas. But in the Christian tradition, it's organic inspiration, which means that God doesn't just, put someone into a trance and they start writing, but God is moving through the normal processes of history. And then you say, well, how can he move through that? Now, it's a funny question to ask, because no ancient would ask it. Yet we're going to have to engage this question at some point between, and I think this is really some of the real interesting things that you would want to engage Peterson in terms of, okay, well, we've got this entire tradition of Christian practice where we bow our heads and we either talk in our head or we speak out loud, we pray as if we're talking to another human being. Well, what's that about? And we look up in the sky, and what's that about? And heaven is up and hell is down and the earth is here, and what's that about? So And how should someone who is listening to Peterson, who might begin from a presuppositional place to say, well, I believe in evolution. Well, okay, well, here in a sense, what Peterson is giving you is a evolutionary argument to take the Bible seriously. And in other speeches and other places, Peterson will say, act as if it is true. Now, that's really interesting to me, and I'm going to continue to play with that idea. But even this whole idea of, okay, well, how do we regard the Bible? And for a long time, I've wondered about the idea that, well, I see people over here who, in fact, there are biblical stories about there, people over here who don't believe any of it, but actually do good. People over here who say they believe it, and they're morally outrageous. Now, C.S. Lewis talks about that in Mere Christianity, and I think he gives some good arguments, but this whole business, part of what's really intriguing me about Peterson is, okay, well, let's unpack this. So Jordan Peterson, in a sense, is establishing a foundation for people who look at evolution and say, yeah, it's just obvious. Look at our DNA. Look at the natural world. Of course evolution is true. But in a sense, undoing Darwin and saying, because evolution is true and because Darwin is right, therefore you should take the Bible seriously. So of course people like Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris are going to say, wait a minute, we thought we exorcised this demon. And Peterson says, no, this is exactly why we should listen to this book. Then you've got a bunch of Christians over here who perhaps are anti-evolution, and they're going to say, well, that's just wrong. You should just believe the Bible is the Word of God. But Peterson quite rightly asks, well, what do you mean by the Word of God? And I've found for a long time, part of what I do in my Sunday school classes, someone will come into my Sunday school class, wonderful Christian, quite innocently, just flop down a pat Christian answer to a question, and I will just ask them one more question, and they're out of their depths. What does it mean the Bible is the Word of God? That's not an easy thing to answer. And so when Peterson says, what does it mean to believe? Well, that's actually a very good question. And in fact, what we do, at least what we do in my church, and what I want to see done in church, is that we wrestle with these questions. Because to just stand up and say, I believe the Bible is the Word of God, I believe in Jesus as my Savior. If you confess with your lips and believe in your heart, and sometimes I will stop people and say, well, confess with your lips, I understand what that means. What do you mean by believe in your heart? If the Bible is supposed to be accurate in terms of geology, shouldn't it also be accurate in terms of autonomy? And well, there's nerves down there, but it doesn't say nerves. It's, this is enormously complex. And so I think as Christians, at least for myself, we ought to engage in these questions. And so I find Peterson tremendously fun to engage with. Well, I just got lost in a rant, and now I'm getting sidetracked. So organic inspiration, that God moves in history. God moves in Hosea's life, and God moves in Paul's life, and God moves in Isaiah's life. And this is what emerges from it. And the truth is, as Peterson rightly says, the vast majority of the Bible is written by we don't know who. Oh, we have ideas, maybe people at this time, and maybe people in this role, and people with these resources, but most of the Bible is anonymously written. And we simply don't know, with the exception of Paul. And if you look at some really interesting things by Gary Habermas and the resurrection, there's some interesting. It's very curious that we know so much about Paul and 1 Corinthians 15, but I won't go there. I too often go down rabbit trails. So you have then Brett Weinstein saying, okay, I can understand this. There's an evolution of communities, and in a sense, the group with the best story wins. But what you wind up with then is in a sense the problem of pragmatism, Darwin, and truth. And that in a sense that you can say, well, if what these stories are giving a community is an evolutionary advantage to prevail over their other community, and actually this was worked out fairly selectively in the United States during the Cold War, that in a sense part of the reason church attendance reached its peak in the Cold War in the United States was that we believed God was an asset in fighting communism, not just in terms of our prayers, but someone could make an evolutionary argument and say we prevailed over the Soviet Union because of God. Others might say we prevailed over the Soviet Union because of the marketplace. The difficulty you face with an argument like that is that there are so many counterexamples that before the rise of Nazism, Germany was about the most Christian country you could find in the world. Why did it cave so easily to Nazi paganism? So you've got this argument that basically says, well, we can't really know the truth, but the closer we are to the truth, the better we will adapt, the better we will compete, and so therefore we're always approximating the truth. Now I would recommend two books, again, C.S. Lewis's Miracles, which again I think is just an immensely helpful book, but also Alvin Plantinga. I mentioned him in my previous video, Where the Conflict Really Lies, where you have to ask yourself the question that, can Darwin and pragmatism get us close enough to the truth? And in some sense, that's in a sense the challenge behind Peterson, because, well, we don't know, do we? I was listening to one YouTube where when one astrophysicist was talking about the fact that, you know, are there life in other planets? It might have been a Veritas Forum video. Are there life in other planets? And he says, well, we've gotten to this point. We haven't killed each other yet. Well, that's good. But what other challenges lie ahead? And obviously, in terms of a Christian narrative, there's a controlling narrative that offers emotional hope on one sense, but that you embrace, that says, well, you know, we ought to be, we actually have hope in the future. But both Plantinga and Lewis very much engage the question of, but can we really know truth if all we've been adapted to do is compete? And one of the interesting groups when I was thinking about this was, the story of the Jews. Since the Jewish stories outlasted the Babylonians, everybody knows who Yahweh is in the Bible, and only in the 19th century did we dig up Gilgamesh. Shouldn't you say that the Jews should be out competing? And now on one hand they are, because they're still around, and we're no longer looking at the Hittites or the Babylonians in the same way, even though Saddam Hussein tried to resurrect it. In a sense, these stories prevailed over other stories, and you could look at history perhaps as competition between stories, and in some ways throughout the whole medieval period it was the Islamic world versus the Christian world, at least in the parts of the former Roman Empire. And now you've got Christianity growing in Africa and Asia and China. Well, is history finally the story of competing stories? Well, again, the Jews are a funny example, because on one hand, were their stories better? Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed Jerusalem. And it's at about that time that we think actually a lot of the stuff got written down. So who won that war, really? Was it Nebuchadnezzar, or was it the Jews? And so you have the story of the Jews, which are, look at a people who, have basically had the world against them, but they've been so doggedly determined to preserve their culture. It's actually one of the most remarkable stories about humanity. And so, but their story gets popularized not so much by, let's say, in the first century, there's a split in Judaism basically between the rabbinic tradition, which is one approach to the Old Testament, and Christianity, which is another approach to the Old Testament. And as, for example, if you read N.T. Wright's, if you really want to read something fat, you can read N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God, where he basically says, the existence of Christianity is the best argument for the historicity of the resurrection that we have. So history is this crazy thing, and again, in The Grand Miracle, which is probably the best chapter in this book, where Lewis basically says, we imagine such a democratic approach to reality when nothing in evolution or in history is at all democratic. History is this crazy thing, and so here perhaps, if I'm going to play with Brett Weinstein and Sam Harris, perhaps it's not really our genes that are competing for history. Perhaps it is in fact our stories that are competing for history. So culture and belief. So here we are, and everyone walks around and thinking, well, sociology of knowledge works on everybody else but me, and then but that basically assumes that I am a buffered self, and this is American culture. And Charles Taylor has this idea, and this is part of his his argument from 1500 to now, why so few people believe in God as compared to 500 years ago. Well, we believe that we are a buffered self. But now when you look at Peterson and Jung, you begin to see that parts of me are watching everything all the time. I'm not that buffered. And, study after study of all kinds of weird psychological things come out to realize we're being impacted by all sorts of things. The book 1493, these malarial mosquitoes get in. And so why did African slavery, get strong in this one area of the United States and not another? Why in the southern United States? Why in Brazil and not Argentina? Why not in Massachusetts and why in Virginia? And then this particular author goes and says, well, mosquitoes. And I think, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I am not nearly as buffered from anything. So why should I imagine I am buffered from God, if a God exists? So can materialists finally found, and this I think is always the big question, can they finally find a foundation for their ought? Why must I embrace your value system? Why must I embrace any value system? Just so you can regard me as a good person? And again, so you've got sociology of knowledge working. We are hardly buffered in just about any way. And again, one of the things that I appreciate about this is that we know more than we know we know. And so this idea, and that I think is quite true, that we are far more complex than we know. We act out and we do things we don't realize that we know we're doing. So how can we account for this? And then Peterson turns and says, if you just look on the face of it, you'd better read this book, or at least come to terms with it, if you actually want to have any clue about how we got here. Well, that's what I got for now. Not entirely happy with how it ended, but that's the way it goes. If I'm going to have time to do these things, they're going to have to be first drafts. So I just looked at comments today, and I was, I'm a pastor of a tiny little church in Sacramento, California, and I am not an important person in almost any respect. But I'm just surprised that anybody listens to this. But then again, a lot of people say to me, I'm surprised you listen to Jordan Peterson videos. But I find that there are tens of thousands of people out there doing this, which I guess is the miracle of the internet, if I may use this word. So thank you for watching, and thank you for indulging me. And leave a comment. And again, why do I bother doing this? Well, I do this because, and again, when I look at Peterson, because parts of me that are behind me are, prompting me to do this. Is that God? Is that some, leftover stuff from my father? Is that, why? I have no idea, but I do it, and here it is. And if you find it helpful, I'm a happy man. If you don't find it helpful, it's good enough for me doing it myself. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment, subscribe. I hope it's worthwhile.